Okay, this is I Read Old Magazines, and we're back with the article Catholic School Plots Exposed. Um, Subtitle Who's Snuffing Your Neighbor's Kittens? I didn't write that. This is an article from Executive Intelligence Review of the Larouche organization, and of course, they're very styled in propaganda. They also revealed this Anglo-American network of Carlist, anti-communist, but also really anti-Catholic, nominal Catholics around William Buckley and Opus Dei and neoconservative Catholics and the knuckle-dragging traditionalists. Now, it's not every traditionalist is not a knuckle dragger, but there's certainly many that simply have no knowledge of history. They operate from an American lens, meaning they have this very spotty history. They have no understanding of the development of Europe or anything like this throughout the ages. And yet they presumed Hapsburgs back on the throne. Oh, we need to get rid of the American Republican government. As decrepit as the American government is, and have LARP type stuff. And there's a little dossier that was also involved with this Society for the Christian Commonwealth of William S. Buckley and Jr. and others. And he's one of these new right individuals, CNP or Heritage Foundation type guys that is very pro-Carlist and runs around in these traditional Catholic circles operating around Christendom College in North Virginia. Who is Paul Weyrich? Paul M. Weyrich, a major influence in Washington and Christendom College, is one of the leading creators of the Vox Populi furor over such Gnostic single issues as free trade, family values, and abortion, using Madison Avenue techniques to advance his social conservative agenda. Weyrich is a convert from Roman Catholicism to the Melkite Greek Church, Uniate Church in communion with Rome. That's a head scratcher. And is a proto-deacon of that confession in the Diocese of Arlington. He often speaks at Christendom College. So he converted to the Melkite Greek Church after probably a bout of doubt in the Roman Rite. Of course, everybody knows that there's certain, I think it's Council of Trent put certain rules in place, canon law in place, which you're supposed to stay within your communion and not go to other churches. There's a tendency towards the Roman Rite to look Eastern. And eventually I'm going to read a lot of things on the origins of Nazism, as well as the origins of Bolshevism, and they're all Eastern creations. And strangely, two other major culprits in world history, the Venetian Empire and the British Empire, have always looked to the East. Venice was a Orthodox satellite and founded two Arian bishoprics, and it started the Fourth Crusade on behalf of the Byzantine Empire. And then Britain, sometime between 1600s, 1800s, you get this Orientalist movement, where even some Jesuits were involved in that whole thing, in promoting Orientalism. And out of that, you get things like John Ruskin, you get the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, all of these things that lead up to Mazzini networks, and like Young America, Young Italy, et cetera, and eventually out of that grows these Nazi youth movements and things like this. And that's a very simplistic version of it, but the East and the doctrines against reason, those doctrines that are Manichaean in nature or highly mystical in nature, are probably the most evil thing, an evil tool used to control people. God himself, we believe, is, it's not thought thinking himself, but it's akin to that. It's an analog. And even under the idea of absolute divine simplicity, God is rational. And yet we always see people in modern religious fervor tending towards the irrational. And that's the biggest danger in traditional Catholicism too, is they're developing this simulacrum where they're taking a very heavily reason-based tradition in the West and starting to impose onto it these Eastern kinds of mystagogy. So anyway, continuing with Paul M. Weyrich, he was a former congressional aide. Weyrich in 1973 teamed with Edwin Fulner and bankrolled by Joseph Coors, founded the Heritage Foundation, a peculiar melange of British Fabian Society, London's International Institute for Strategic Studies, and most importantly, the Free Trade and Drug Legalization Institute, known as the Mont Pelerin Society, which made Democratic Party presidential pre-candidate Lyndon LaRouche a major target. Leaving Fulner in charge of Heritage, Weyrich went on to launch a host of single-issue institutions. He founded the Free Congress Foundation, which, unlike Heritage, could act as a political action committee. He convinced Jerry Falwell, the minister, to found the Moral Majority in 1979 for Christian right organizations, through the Free Congress Research and Education Foundation and affiliated Kriebel Institute. He helped launch the organized crime-linked oligarchs in Russia, bending Russian policy with the Freedom and Democracy Institute of Russia and Project Democracy's International Republican Institute. In 1979, with former Colgate palm oil olive ad man Southern Baptist Edward McAteer, Weyrich co-founded the Religious Roundtable, a conveyor belt for the old right to the new right. And 5. During 1981-82, Weyrich was treasurer and now executive committee member of the Council on National Policy. Weyrich, in February 1998, was appointed to a 5-year term on the Amtrak Reform Council. In 1998, he became its vice chairman. In its final report, he suggested the same disastrous privatization policy that has famously ruined the national rail system of Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair's Britain. And that's a little blurb about Paul M. Weyrich from Scott Thompson. So continuing with part 2 of a private Catholic move. Okay, and it starts with the word but. And yet there's not really any context for that, so not maybe perhaps the best written article. Anyway, but the creation of Christendom College was only one part of an expanding movement to take over the Catholic Church in Northern Virginia and beyond. Modeled on the methods of the fascist Carlist movement in 1930s Spain, Warren Carroll's wife, Anne Westhoff Carroll, has been a kind of cult figure for school movement. Anne Carroll is a Carlist ideologue in her own right. In fact, she worked for Triumph magazine beginning in 1970 before Warren Carroll joined her at the magazine in 1973. She was raised as a Catholic, whereas he has described himself as having been a deist before his conversion. They met in 1962 and married in 1968, at which point he converted to Catholicism. She, like most fascists, is an intellectual lightweight, but it's no means insignificant, also ran in these Gnostic circles. In March 1973, Anne Carroll wrote an article in Triumph which laid out her perspective for the creation of what she called private Catholic apostolic schools. In this article, she wrote that the school community should see itself just as does the community of contemplative nuns or regiment of soldiers or the artisans' guild in Christian society. They will learn the almost unknown stories of great Catholic heroes, Ask any Catholic child, including those attending parochial school, if he knows of Red Hugh O'Donnell or Don Juan of Austria. The latter reputedly won the Battle of Lepanto against the Turks in 1571, which the Carlist called revisionist theory of history, regards as the most important event in modern history of the human species. Clash of Civilizations, folks. In the October 1974 issue of Triumph, Anne Carroll wrote an article entitled The Apostolic School Revisited, discussing her experience in creating such a school. In the fall of 1973, I attempted to practice what I had been preaching by opening the Christian Commonwealth School in Warrenton, Virginia. Because the local parochial school ended with the 7th grade, we began with 8th grade with plans of eventually expanding into the full-scale high school. We reopened for a second year this fall. We need apostolic schools because we need apostles. In areas where there is no Catholic school or Catholic school is no longer Catholic, parents should give serious consideration to setting up their own apostolic school where modern secular culture would be deliberately counteracted and Catholic culture deliberately instilled. For example, at various times throughout the year, they, her students, volunteered to go to Ulster to help the Catholics there, defended the Crusades, the Inquisition, and the order of society in Middle Ages. Now, I'm just going to take a break here. This is a quote, but these people always look back to the Middle Ages and not the Renaissance and not the Enlightenment, where the church made tremendous theological progress. Not progress, but I don't know what to say. Not progress in the sense of anything new, but understandings. And legitimization, being able to accurately debunk all of these other philosophies that came along. The church was able to defend itself and defend new policies. And you look at somebody like Clement XIV or something like this, was able to get rid of the Jesuits, who have been a scourge on the church for a long time, not since its beginning, but pretty much since its beginning. But he was absolutely an Enlightenment era man, an artist, a polymath, I think, maybe considered a polymath, but was actually incredibly invested in real ecumenism, trying to get the old church back into the Roman Church in the Middle East. In the Middle Ages, these things were not really that possible because of tremendous limitations of technology, as well as all sorts of political maneuvering. The high ages of the church were not the Middle Ages, but some people have to go back that far, because in the Middle Ages there were a lot of there was this concept of the warrior and being tied to land and blood and soil politics that these fascists absolutely, base everything on. And it's not, it is a LARP. It really is a LARP, live action role play. But going on. Okay, so her students go and defend the Crusades, the Inquisition, and the order of society in the Middle Ages. Thought it unforgivable that Americans had fought on the side of Republicans in the Spanish Civil War, and that the American businessmen would aid the Soviet Union. Wished America were a Catholic country so that there would be a feast day processions down Main Street. You can still do that. This early experiment was to become the pilot project for the creation of an expanding number of Catholic elementary and high schools in Northern Virginia, including Seton High School in Manassas, Annunciation Academy in Reston, and St. John Bosco in Leesburg. Although Seton High School had been in existence for some time, Annunciation received its impetus only in March 1994 when a member of a schism from the Catholic Church, Gary Matactics, was invited to speak at St. Catherine of Siena on the topic of creating private Catholic schools. St. John Bosco High School was a later extension of Annunciation. According to eyewitness reports of an active participant after Matactics' March 1994 speech, a number of moms at St. Catherine decided to create a private elementary school, initially in Vienna, Virginia, and now in Reston, called Annunciation Academy. One of the parishioners called up St. Thomas Aquinas University in California to see if she could find a graduate who would be interested in being headmaster. She spoke to Vincent Terreri, who had just graduated and was working in the admissions office. He mentioned that he might be interested. That summer, he came from California to Virginia to begin interviewing teachers and parents. After only a year or so of operation, there was a parents' revolt against Terreri. In stepped Ann Carroll, as a member of a new board of directors established to quell the parent revolt. Through January 2002, a number of changes were made at Annunciation Academy, consolidating control over the school by the Carrolls. Warren Carroll joined the board, and another Christendom College figure, J. Lawrence McCarty, became its chairman. Also appointed was Joseph Sorbin. Both Joseph Sorbin and Ann Carroll are associated with an organization called the Christian Islamic Forum, located in Burke, Virginia. The founder and its president is Daniel Ali, who, according to February 21, 2002 issue of Arlington Catholic Herald, entered the Catholic Church after studying under the late Reverend William Most. The website homepage of the Christian Islamic Forum promotes an article by Sobrin, in which he reviews the polemic of Hilaire Belloc, who predicted in his 1930s book, The Great Heresies, that Islam would rise to challenge the West. Sorbin ends his review by asking, "Are we seeing the beginning of the fulfillment of Belloc's prophecy?" On January 14, 2002, the Christian Islamic Forum sponsored a seminar at the Holy Spirit Catholic Church in Annandale entitled Ecumenism and Evangelization. Ann Carroll was one of the 4 speakers. In the late 1990s, this network of Carlist schools was expanded to include St. Bosco's High School. Rod Huth, who taught at Annunciation Academy, was selected as headmaster. Vincent Terreri became the chairman of the board of directors of St. John Bosco. Both Terreri and his wife Anne, as well as the Hunts, attended St. Catherine's. The St. John Bosco website announced that it was ready to set up an initiative of the head of the Annunciation Academy in Reston, Vincent Terreri, and founder-director of Seton High School in Manassas, Ann Carroll. Key connections to Christendom. There's the following crucial connection between Christendom College and St. Catherine of Siena Parish, where Justice Antonin Scalia, Louis Freeh, and Robert Hanson were until recently assembled. As we have seen, the entire private Catholic schools movement was initiated by parishioners at St. Catherine and is under the control of direction of Christendom College, centered former members of the Society of Christian Commonwealth, and is the realization of the original Triumph magazine Carlist Guild perspective. The operation has been flanked by a number of key priests centered at St. Catherine of Siena, St. Lawrence Church in Franconia, Virginia, St. Agnes in Arlington, and Our Lady of Hope in Potomac Falls, Virginia. The current pastor at St. Catherine is Reverend Franklin McAfee, who previously was at St. Lawrence. The martyr, along with Reverend Most McAfee, is a member of Opus Dei, the same organization which also claims Robert Hanson, the Soviet spy, and his wife as members. McAfee was also the president of Notre Dame Institute of Catechetics. Father Most, who died in 1999, was also a member of the faculty of the Notre Dame Institute beginning in the late 1980s and taught theology at Ann Carroll's Seton High School. Christendom College Press publishes 3 of his books. After McAfee, Reverend William Saunders, now the pastor at Our Lady of Hope, became the dean of Notre Dame Institute for Catechetics. In 1997, the institute merged with Christendom College and is now called the Notre Dame Graduate School of Christendom College. Saunders also writes the Know Your Faith column in the Arlington Catholic Herald. On one occasion, he wrote a column defending the death penalty after Pope John Paul II had amended the Catechism so as to oppose it. Christendom Press also publishes one of his books. On July 22nd to 24, 2001, Ann Carroll's Seton High School held a conference addressed by openly schismatic Gary Matactics. The conference was sponsored by Colby Center for Study of Creation, initiated the year before Reverend Robert Ruskamp of St. Agnes Parish. Roskamp had been a priest at St. Lawrence as well during McAfee's tenure there. St. Agnes in Arlington is the church of choice of members of the anti-Pope John Paul II Association, Tradition, Family, and Property in Northern Virginia. Now look at Hanson's circle at St. Catherine. In 1994, St. Catherine's deacon Keith Fournier distributed a Christian Coalition election guide to parishioners. He worked directly with Pat Robertson's Christian Coalition. The purpose of the guide was to support the election of Oliver North to the U.S. Senate in Virginia on a single-issue grounds that he was anti-abortion. So there's Iran-Contra. I can't go into the Iran-Contra. We discuss other places on the channel. Heavily tied to Mortimer Bloomfield, who was British Special Operations Executive operating out of Canada as a subversion technique against the United States, or subversion nest against the United States. Adnan Khashoggi, Burra Gold, all these things were tied in with the whole Trump and Palm Springs clique in Florida that we've talked about earlier in the channel. So this is backed by Pat Robertson, and Pat Robertson has this crazy intelligence background too, and maybe we'll go into that later. There's actually an article I read on that. So he had this St. Catherine deacon, Keith Fournier, distributed a Christian Coalition election guide to parishioners. He worked directly with Pat Robertson's Christian Coalition. The purpose of the guide was to support the election of Oliver North to the U.S. Senate in Virginia on a single-issue grounds that he was anti-abortion. The Larouche movement was actively opposing North for his anti-constitutional role in drug-running Iran-Contra operation. Sometime after the distribution of the Christian Coalition election guide, Reverend Jerome Fossimo, who was the pastor of St. Catherine, was replaced by Reverend McAfee. Because of his opposition to the distribution of the Christian Coalition literature of Catholics, Fournier formed the Catholic Alliance to give his work cover for being Catholic. Another major operation at St. Catherine's is the creation of the organization called Aid to the Church in Russia, founded by Reverend Marcel Guarnizo while he was a deacon at St. Catherine. Warren Carroll is on its board of directors, as are Frank Shakespeare and Nina Shea of Freedom House. Given that Robert Hansen, a parishioner of St. Catherine's, pled guilty to spying for the Soviets and then the Russians, the fact that the organization was created at St. Catherine and involves Warren Carroll is not insignificant. Note, in this connection, the fact that Paul Weyrich is also actively involved in Russia through the Kriebel Institute, of which he had appointed president in 1989. Weyrich also had been, since 1997, on the board of directors of the Freedom and Democracy Institute in Russia. The other connection between Hansen and the Christendom College crowd is a network which penetrates or is run by Opus Dei. As reported above, Reverend McAfee is publicly declared member of Opus Dei, as is Hansen. One of Hansen's daughters, Susan Hansen, is a member of the University of Dallas, where she lives at the Opus Dei residence. She spent the year 2000 in the United Kingdom studying G.K. Chesterton. Frederick Wilhelmsmann taught for 4 years at the University of Navarra in Pamplona, Spain, which is an Opus Dei university. Alexandria Wilhelmsmann received her PhD from the same Opus Dei university. Now, another editorial, Opus Dei, the founder, Jose Maria Escriva, admitted members of the Communist Party into the Opus Dei when it was an excommunicable offense, and you don't get a hearing with that. It automatically happens. Now, since then, I think Jose Maria Escriva is either canonized or on the process of canonization. Of course, we have to note that the sainthood process no longer has the devil's advocate, so you can't present any evidence that the person was not a saint, and therefore it's invalid. a lot of these canonizations. Some of them are possible canonizations, right? It doesn't mean every single saint is a saint, but it's come out after this devil's advocacy has been taken away. But certainly this kind of evidence, which he brags about in his own writings, Jose Maria Escriva does, should be a warning that Opus Dei is not what it appears to be. But his connections to the Catholic Identity Conference, which, like I said before, lots of well-intentioned people there. You have two of these people which have been connected with Opus Dei through Mark Brammer, that were kind of the openers of this conference. They were the big stars there. Michael Voris and E. Michael Jones. And E. Michael Jones is absolutely fascist. He defends Hjalmar Schacht. Hjalmar Schacht is the guy that basically played into the hands of the Anglo-American usurers that were trying to gut the German economy. And he says exactly the opposite thing. But you don't understand when you inflate the money supply, that's when a foreign interest can come in and buy up all your state assets. Meanwhile, all of the German people who were basically destroyed. The poor Germans. And the handicapped, and all these people that you're not supposed to write off in civilization were written off. And there's people who think that it's trendy and oh, well, this is just what a conservative does. From a Catholic perspective, you can't write those people off. There's part of the mystery of iniquity. They're not all handicapped and orphaned or whatever because of their own sin. General sin also is the cause of these things. The fall is the cause of these things. It's not everybody's fault, That's the mystery of iniquity. And trying to solve the mystery of iniquity by eradicating the poor is heretical. Because you're trying to solve the mystery of iniquity and say, well, these are the people that are evil and we'll just have to write them off. But going on. When theological riddlement stayed home, many parents who might be lured into sending their children to fascist schools are deluded into thinking that their children will receive a better education there than public school. And that's probably the case now, but going on. Such parents are either ignorant or willfully blind to the most important question, which is who runs these schools and what's their political agenda. The second related question is, what is the poison they are disseminating to your children in the guise of being true Catholics? As we shall see, a crucial aspect of this Carroll's operation is redefining the curriculum used in private schools, homeschooling, and correspondence courses. One of Ann Carroll's projects is Catholic Educators Resource Center. She is on the advisory board. She makes the following points in introduction for junior and senior high school social studies or history students. Here's part of the curriculum. The Crusades were a just war. Okay, so every single crusade, even the fourth one, which wasn't even a Catholic crusade, more or less was Venetian orchestrated with Venice and Byzantine Empire by one dethroned king to regain the empire. I mean, it's just in a sense, but in terms of being just expense of Catholic civilization, absolutely not. Going on. God acts in history. We can see this action in Old Testament history, but not just here. Why did Don Juan of Austria win at Lepanto? The Inquisition did not unjustly slaughter thousands of people simply because they practiced a different religion. That could be true. Franco was not a Nazi dictator who overthrew a legitimate government and set up a police state. Internet articles by Ann Carroll elaborate on these so-called ideas. In an article of on the Inquisitions, he writes of Spanish Queen Isabel's vision could not come true until all of Spain was once again in Christian hands. The people fought with the fervor of the Crusades, and the war, after all, was a crusade, a defense of Christendom against the Muslims. Isabel knew that Spain's unity as a nation depended upon a strong church. Spain might as well not exist if it were not Catholic through and through. These false conversos and moriscos, converted Jews and Moors, were a threat to the church in Spain. But to protect the innocent, the guilty had to be found. Those found guilty were traitors to the state and to the church, and treason has almost always been recognized as a crime justifying capital punishment. The Inquisition, in fact, though not perfect, was a more just court than most. Anne Carroll is also involved in an organization called the Catholic Schools History Project, begun in 1996 in order to write a new history series for Catholic schools. The Board of Consulting Editors lists Miss Anne Carroll, Seton School, Manassas, who is also one of the writers of the series. The list of supporters of this project include Her Imperial Highness Alexander von Hapsburg, Archduchess of Austria, and Vincent Terreri, Headmaster, Annunciation Academy, and Chairman of Board of St. John Bosco High School. 3 of the 6 writers and 6 of the 22 supported listed are all from the University of Dallas. One of those Anne Carroll's fellow history writers for Catholic school children is Dr. Alexandra Wilhelmsman, University of Dallas, the daughter of Frederick Wilhelmsman. Alexandra graduated from the University of Dallas in 1967 and is now a professor of Spanish and an adjunct professor of history there. She got her BA from the University of Dallas, her MA from Rice, and PhD in history at the University of Navarra, Spain. In 1995, she published La Formación del Pensamiento Político del Carlismo, 1810 to 1875, Madrid Editorial Actus. She is a member of the editorial board of Faith and Reason, Christendom College. She has written 15 articles on Spain's traditional political movement, known as Carlism. She is currently doing research on the life in exile, mainly in Italy, of the Carlist branch of Spanish royal family. In addition to involvement in the Catholic Schools History Project and Catholic Education Resource Center, Anne Carroll promotes her fascist curriculum through the Seton Home Study School, which came into existence as an offshoot of Seton School in Manassas. It started out operating from a small room in Seton School building. Then the Home Study Division moved to the small office in Front Royal in 1994. Enrollment at the beginning of 1997 stood at 8,500. Seton also serves thousands more students through private parent-operated schools. Catholic schools which use Seton materials and through book sales directly to Catholic families. It had 130 people on the payroll as of 1997. Many of the graduates of the Seton Home Study School enroll in Christendom College. Against this background, judge the impact of Christendom College in spreading the universal fascism of Clash of Civilizations into the spreading slime mold of little schools and home schooling programs. Christendom College and Brzezinski's faction. And this is going to tie directly to how liberal, essentially Freemasonic British imperial policies of Zbigniew Brzezinski, who's a big Ford Foundation guy, was Obama's mentor, is influencing the Christian right on the issue of the Clash of Civilizations. 3 books, 2 by Warren and 1 by Carroll, spotlight the Carlist fascist ideology, which is the spine of the current Brzezinski-Huntington drive for Clash of Civilizations, beginning with a book published by Christendom Press, written by Warren H. Carroll in 1991, entitled Isabel of Spain, the Catholic Queen. In this book, even as Carroll supports the expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492, he effectively argues that the Israelis are justified in expelling the Muslims today, just as Spain was then. So you also have Zionist Christians defending the Israeli state, which was created by, I think, one of Lord Kitchener's agents and the British Foreign Office, most certainly. I can't remember. I mean, the foundations were set by the Quattro Coronati Lodge of Edwin Bulwer Lytton. and those people in those immediate circles, and then eventually by Lord Balfour, who was married into the Lytton family. Um, Meanwhile, working with Jabotinsky and those people, the fascist Israeli movement, to expel the Palestinians and sneak the Jews in. And sneaking the Jews in is almost word for word something in one of Kitchener's secretary's papers, in the Kitchener Papers. So let's go on. The first chapter in the Catholic Queen book by Anne Carroll is entitled The Longest Crusade, 711 to 1451. Isabel is portrayed as the last in a long line, 24 generations of Spanish crusaders to reconquer Spain from the infidel Moors. Carroll writes that many of the Muslims and Jewish conversos were exemplary Christians, but others were suspect, and still others were secret traitors, criminals, blasphemers, and even Satanists. Now that's true, right? But going on. There is convincing, indeed overwhelming evidence, which even the most critical historians have acknowledged, that tens of thousands of false conversos who did not believe in Christianity they professed, and by all indications never had believed in it, continuing to live secretly by the teachings and rites of their former religions. No one can excuse these pogroms, the threats, and the forced baptisms, nor can the restrictions which made life so difficult for those who continued to profess their original faith be fully justified. But in fairness, it must be pointed out that such restrictions on religious minorities were universal in that age, most certainly found in Muslim as well in Christian countries, and to a substantial degree in modern Israel as well. Every false converso in Spain was a potential traitor, a man capable of, and very possibly inclined to, opening the gates to the likes of the Turkish mass killers of Otranto, welcoming the invader into the land to kill his countrymen and saw bishops in two. Isabel saw the Inquisition is clearly necessary to preserve the security and promote the spiritual and social unity of Spain. The enduring cause of the Reconquest had defined Spain by its Catholic faith in a way matched by no other country, unless by Ireland and Poland, whose nationality has been largely defined by persecutions of their people's Catholic faith. Because of this history, in all three of these countries up until the last few years, to reject the Catholic faith has been, to all intents and purposes, to reject the nationality. Isabel could trust no Spaniard that was not a Catholic, and particularly none who pretended to be Catholic but were not. Neither could her people. Such deceivers must be exposed, then reconciled if possible, or forced to flee, or if stubborn and beyond reclamation in their evil, executed. According to Carol Torquemada, the Grand Inquisitor was a just and devout man and a careful administrator. As part of her essential task of unifying Spain and bringing it into justice and peace and good order, Isabel founded the Spanish Inquisition. In fact, the Spanish Inquisition, as she established it, was very much needed in Spain. The decree ordering the expulsion of the Jews gives as the primary reason for the issuance of the activity of professed Jews in trying to persuade conversos who had been Jews or whose ancestors had been Jews to leave the Catholic Church and return to Judaism. But there were undoubtedly other reasons. Spain was now unified for the first time in nearly 800 years. Isabel and Fernando believed this new unity must be preserved at all costs, and the Inquisition had proved some Jews were a real threat to it. Carroll continues on the forced conversion of Muslims after the revolt in Granada in 1499 that Archbishop Cisneros may have been wrong, but he had a case. And the fruits were good, at least in respect the danger of religious war in Spain in the long run was substantially lessened. He reports that after further Muslim revolts against this policy, on February 11, 1501, they decreed that all Muslims under the authority of the Kingdom of Castile must choose conversion or exile by the end of April. It was exactly the same policy, with the same conditions and almost the same span for decision that had been applied to all the Jews in Castile in 1492. The same decree was applied to all the Moors and the rest of Spain in February 1502. Thus, the tenacious resistance to dispossession from their ancestral lands, for which Muslims all over the world are famous, combined with the fiercely unremitting zeal of Archbishop Cisneros and the immovable determination of Isabel and Fernando to secure the great reconquest once and for all, produced a tragic but probably unavoidable outcome. Arguments to justify what Isabel and Fernando did to the Moors are much stronger arguments to justify the expulsion of the Jews in 1942. Despite the similarity of decrees, procedures used because the events of 1499, 1501 had left no doubt that the Moors, especially those who clung to their ancestral religion, were relentless fighters who could be expected to rebel again, if not removed. Exactly the same logic was used by the Jews of Israel in the 20th century in expelling the Arab inhabitants of their territories. The justification may be debated, but it is not without basis. So that is excerpt from Warren H. Carroll's 1991 book, Isabel of Spain, the Catholic Queen. And they're using Zionism as a justification for the actions of a Catholic monarch. Is kind of backwards. Furthermore, not all very good logic. Forced conversions are anti-Catholic, patently anti-Catholic. Doesn't make any sense. So, yeah, going on. So note how this last argument, we're back to the article, note how this last argument is a justification simultaneously for Samuel Huntington's evil clash of civilization doctrine and for the current fascist Israeli Defense Forces policy against the Palestinians. Carroll adds that Isabel's daughter, also named Isabel, actually insisted, as a separate condition of her marriage to King Manuel of Portugal, that Manuel expelled the Jews from Portugal as her mother had expelled from Spain. In his 1996 book, The Last Crusade, Carroll moved on from his defense of murderous anti-Semitism to Franco's fascism. He characterized this book as his most militant. It is a promotion of Carlism and a defense of Franco as a Christian crusader against the communists in Spanish Civil War. Carroll writes of Franco, he was not a tyrant or an oppressor, and certainly no totalitarian. More than any other man, he saved Spain from the worst fate that could befall any nation in 20th century conquest by communism, giving his people instead a generation and a half of peace, security, prosperity, and personal, if not political freedom, in which the Catholic faith was restored and flourished throughout the country. The Valley of the Fallen will stand against the sky as his just monument when all venomous critics are dust. And later, the Carlist, above all, had seen the war from beginning as a crusade and essentially nothing else. Moreover, the Carlists fully acknowledged the authority of Franco and his government. Carroll crafted this book around a sophistry which purports to explain away the fact that the principal military support for Franco's fascism came from Hitler and Mussolini. Unavoidable necessity required Franco to turn to them. He says. He never liked or trusted either man, but Franco could not disdain help from any nation because of the evil of its leaders. Then Carroll defended Franco's use of Moroccan troops to carry out his coup d'etat by direct appeal to Brzezinski's war in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union, which funded and armed al-Qaeda. When Christian and Muslim face each other, they are usually hostile and often violently so, but when they jointly face an external atheist enemy, they become strong allies. The most recent example of this is the magnificent struggle of the Mujahideen, freedom fighters of Afghanistan, against the Soviet Union and the aid provided to them from the West. He treats the fact that Franco never held an election with the same sophistry he employed, and he attempts to explain away Franco's alliance with fellow fascists Mussolini and Hitler. Elections and representative government had never worked very well in Hispanic countries, where most did not see them as they were seen in English-speaking countries and in France as conveying genuine legitimacy to the government. So before we go on to this next section, which is called the Black Legend, you see the same thing with people that are from the tradition, God and property, but it's, what's it called? Tradition in action. They're part of this wider movement that I can't even remember the name of. But I caught them supporting the Ukrainian Revolution, which was backed by CIA under Obama, Samantha Power, and John McCain. And one of the guys, I believe it was the Yatsenuk, the guy founded something called the Joseph Goebbels Institute for Propaganda. He had all sorts of, openly Nazi groups. And at the same time, You had openly gay Nazi groups marching down the streets in Ukraine. And somehow the Tradition and Action people were praising this as a triumph for the West against the evils of Soviet Putin. And it's absolutely ridiculous. Um, the level of game playing these people do, mental gymnastics these people do. They can't figure out that they're serving the CIA, and meanwhile they are also advocating the undermining of the American government consistently. Um, so this very much rings true even till today. Um, I don't know if all of the same players are involved, but the Tradition and Action group definitely showed their hand there, and they still defend people like Prince Charles. And I don't have to explain why that's wrong, or maybe Prince Andrew, people like this. Okay, going on. The Black Legend. The fact that the Christendom-based little schools homeschooling octopus is spreading fascist indoctrination in these programs is exposed by reference to another book in the series, Anne Carroll's Christ in Americas. This book is used as at the Seton School and is indicative of anti-American Carlist propaganda, which any school associated with the Carroll Circle employs, whether or not this particular book is employed explicitly within the classroom. Christ in Americas defends Spain against all criticism by transparent sophistry, which could deceive only an illiterate. Anne Carroll defends Spain against all unpleasant evidence concerning its bloody history during the 16th and 17th centuries by blaming all the unpleasant facts of the Black Legend. The Black Legend is the common belief fostered by propaganda from primarily English and Dutch sources that Spaniards are unusually cruel, greedy, and depraved, that in nearly every controversy, Spain represents the wrong side. Yeah, actually, I'm surprised, editorializing here, I'm surprised the Larouche movement would say this, because they identified the Dutch and British as the primary source of evil at these times. A lot of Black Legend is man, when my brain just shuts down, over exaggeration, right? Propaganda, but we'll go on and see where this goes. That the Spaniards are unusually cruel, greedy, and depraved, that in nearly every controversy, Spain represents the wrong side. The Black Legend came to be accepted, especially in English-speaking countries, because the most widely read documents about Spain were written by her mortal enemies, the English and the Dutch. So, does she really believe what she imputes to this Black Legend, or is she once again a witting liar? Also on this account, neither of the Carrolls, it must be repeated, is noted for scholarly accuracy or attention to historical truth. It is true that during the 1511-1648 period, when Spain's monarchy and its Austrian cousins were playing the leading role in plunging much of Europe into the dark age of religious wars, the English and the Dutch, among victims of Philip II's crimes against humanity, had some unpleasant and also some untruthful things to say of the sort one expects in seasons of war propaganda then and now. Any competent historian would have known, contrary to the fanatical and silly Anne Carroll, that Venice, which remained the hegemonic imperial maritime and financial power of the Mediterranean region in the 17th century, was playing the Spanish, the French, the English, and the Netherlands against one another, chiefly by concocting religious warfare. But Anne Carroll reveals the true purpose behind her reference to the Black Legend by using it to attack the constitutional principles of the United States Republic. Her argument, warts and all, was repeatedly copied by her understudy, Fernando Gojano, who, as her book does, made it openly publicized, repeatedly stated central feature of attempted takeover of Larouche's association from no later than 1990 Labor Day conference held in Virginia. Carroll proceeds from the subject of the Black Legend to weave it into virtually treasonous attacks on the very existence of the United States. She attacks the Declaration of Independence, claiming that it reflects the liberal philosophy of Thomas Jefferson, which is somewhat untrue. The opening section sets forth his liberal philosophy. He stated that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, not from God, not from traditions, not by inheritance, but from the people themselves. All authority comes from them. It is usually opposed to hereditary monarchy. It emphasizes that men should be free to do whatever they want in moral matters, and that political authority comes from the people themselves, who should be free to overthrow existing governments by violence if necessary, and to set new governments based on the will of the majority as interpreted and guided by intellectual leaders. She makes the false argument that the notion of government by consent of the governed is contrary to the will of God. But of course, the concept of consent of the governed derives originally from the Catholic concordance of Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa in the 15th century, that man is created in the likeness of God the Creator, and therefore the power of reason in the governed gives the ability and the right to consent in government for the common good. Carroll continues with a characteristically Gnostic argument. We Americans are so used to thinking that governmental authority should come from the people that we might see nothing wrong with the political ramifications of liberalism. We need to be reminded that all authority comes from God, and if authority is not exercised in harmony with God's law, then it is not legitimate. The standard is not, is it the will of the people, but is it the will of God? She, like Gnostic Justice Antonin Scalia, is thereby attacking one of the fundamental tenets of Christianity from the standpoint of medievalist form of mystery religion. She's attacking the principle of love of humanity identified by the idea of the general welfare and the common good, against the principle of agape. Not only does this leading intellectual of the home schools and Catholic little schools attack and outright falsify the Declaration of Independence, but also the U.S. Constitution. Always the sort of populist who makes up her facts as her whims require, the silly goose who shows her feathers, in this wild statement. Why did this theoretically excellent system break down? The Constitution itself had one serious flaw. Madison, rightly regarded as the father of the Constitution, stated that the sovereignty, source of authority, should rest in the people. In other words, the government received all its authority from the consent of the people. Since the rebirth of civilization after the Dark Ages, man has regarded sovereignty as coming from God, but God is not mentioned in the Constitution. By placing sovereignty in the people rather than in God and divine law, the framers of the Constitution left the door open for any evil so long as it was justified by majority rule. In Christian societies, the church was the ultimate check on any would-be tyrant, but this check did not exist in the United States. Presumably, the U.S. Confederate Constitution, which does mention God, would be more to her liking. What she fundamentally rejects is the notion of representative government as opposed to theocracy. Moreover, she lies, claiming that the Declaration of Independence and U.S. Constitution are not based on divine or natural law. Now, there's a distinction there, but we're going on. Rather, like her co-thinker, Justice Scalia, she denies the existence of natural law, and just as he attacks Pope John Paul II's opposition to death sentences from a feudalist standpoint, so does she. Her illiteracy shows again when she ignores the fact that neither the Declaration of Independence nor a federal constitution is based on the will of the people, but rather on the principles of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and the general welfare, principles which express the Christian apostolic intent of the conception of agape, as that term is defined by Plato's Socratic dialogues, and as that meaning of the term is stated most clearly and empathetically by the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 13, the principle of agape is the summary expression of the essence of the entirety of natural law. She attacks the first U.S. Catholic Bishop John Carroll for accepting the separation of church and state, for example, rejecting a theocratic view. Because of his delight that Catholics were not persecuted by the U.S. government, he perhaps did not see the danger that this policy had of leading to religious indifferentism, the belief that one religion is as good as another, or even to the belief that the person is free to choose practice no religion at all, and to the belief that the church should not interfere with politics. Once again, the silly populist parades her antic whims as if they were solemn facts. From this standpoint, making up alleged facts, as she waddles like a goose down her pathway, she attacks the Monroe Doctrine. Both Monroe and Adams were pro-revolt and anti-Spain, a position understandable in Monroe, who was a protege of Jefferson, but more difficult to understand in the son of John Adams, who had stood virtually alone among U.S. leaders in opposing the French Revolution. Perhaps Adams saw the Latin American countries as reflections of the U.S. in asserting a tradition of self-government against a tyrannical monarch, a false view which has been commonly held by Americans ever since. Little argument on this point might be brushed aside as an example of silly and very illiterate goose efforts to write a page in history. The significance of this passage is the hatred against the very existence of the United States, which she, like her understudy Quijano, who is also habituated to using antic whims as facts, has expressed openly since no later than September 1990. It should come as no surprise that Ann Carroll supports Maximilian Hapsburg against President Benito Juarez in Mexico. The United States has supported Juarez and denounced Maximilian because Juarez boasted of his adherence to liberalism and democracy, but he set up a far tighter control over the country than the so-called autocrat Maximilian had done. After all, Maximilian was a Habsburg, one of her gushing romantics' favorites, and made dictator of Mexico by Napoleon III, who was, like his uncle, and like Ann Carroll's North Virginia co-thinkers, a fascist, and a puppet of the British. Fernando Quijano's denunciations of Juarez to Larouche's associates in Mexico are essentially copies of Carroll's and probably did not originate with her. She supports the fascists on the grounds of her perception that they are not liberal. In respect to Franklin Roosevelt and to the New Deal, she has the following to say. Social Security became deeply entrenched in America, eroding family responsibilities and discouraging thrift. Labor unions became a dominant force in American politics, demanding ever higher wages. They contributed to inflation. That's not how the economy works. The Democrats became the majority party, replacing the Republicans. Became the majority since Lincoln. The Republicans came to be almost exclusively identified as the party of big business, with the Democrats absorbing what remained of progressivism. Most importantly, the principle of subsidiary was virtually destroyed, with Americans coming to depend on the federal government so that henceforth problems would be referred to Washington. So now she hates the Republicans and republics, but then, I don't know. She doesn't like the Democrats. Well, I understand, like, that's a false dichotomy, but false dialectic, more or less. But what's the point of that statement? I don't know. Thus, more tail flutter from this virtual cult figure of her Northern Virginia schooling movement. She laments the abandonment of British-style gold standard by Roosevelt. This tampering with the value of the dollar lessened the confidence which foreign nations and businessmen had in the U.S. and ultimately prolonged the depression by reducing the value of money which people had been saving. Again, the important issue here is not the fact that she once shows herself a very silly sort of Mother Goose, but she waddles in as the elegant Francois Rabelais might have put the point, dropping the fruits of her passing as she goes. Of the Federal Emergency Relief Act, she echoes Michael Novak, another neoconservative Catholic, and the American Enterprise Institute, attacking the role of the federal government in promoting the general welfare by employing a false notion of subsidiary. This legislation marked the real beginning of one of the most important long-lasting effects of the New Deal, the abandonment of the principle of subsidiary. Given that Warren Carroll was recruited in Conservatives USA by Robert Morris, who is part of this Roy Cohn machine that was pretty much founded by British intelligence, also started the blackmail rings that Jeff Epstein has taken over. It is like the same line, direct line to Epstein. That's funny. Robert Morris is related to Dick Morris, and they married into the Roy Cohn family, and they've been working together in New York politics ever since. But going on, Given that Warren Carroll was recruited in Conservatives USA by Robert Morris, president of the University of Dallas, who was the former chief counsel for General Joseph McCarthy, it should also be no surprise that Ann Carroll defends McCarthy. The members of the Leadership Elite Committee of America, although relatively few are actual communists, saw no strong reason for opposing communism because they had abandoned the Christian truth. These were the men McCarthy fought. These were the men who fought him. He died on May 2nd, 1957, the victim of irrational hatred, which has not entirely disappeared even 40 years later. This is what Ann Carroll says about McCarthy. In this context, it should be noted that Triumph magazine often advertised the book McCarthy and His Enemies by William F. Buckley Jr. and L. Brent Bozell, in which ads it was stated that the book sustains McCarthy's basic thesis. Her comments on the assassination of John F. Kennedy also are revealing. Remember that Conservatives USA took out an ad in Dallas paper accusing Kennedy of treason the day he was assassinated, and that the script of the radio show on heroism written by her husband Warren was found in Jack Ruby's car the day he assassinated Lee Harvey Oswald. In the aftermath of the assassinations, writes Carroll, Americans indulged in an orgy of grief, glorifying Kennedy, his family, and everything he had done. Since Kennedy was a liberal, and since Dallas was a conservative city, conservatives were seen as somehow to blame for the president's death, even though Oswald was a communist sympathizer. This reference to Kennedy is very ugly stuff, considering the fact that some of the international circles proven to have been involved in at least politically motivating targeting, as distinguished from the active shooting of President Kennedy, the same circles of Carlists and others who were backers of the 1962 effort, based partly in fascist Spain, to assassinate France's President Charles de Gaulle, and there's Permindex again, were part of the same racial utopian military and intelligence factions to which the Christendom-linked types adhere ideologically today. Okay, well, that was part 2 of the Catholic Schools plot. See how long we took. It is about an hour with all my editorializing. Wish I didn't do that so much. I know nobody's watching, but I'll give myself a like once I end the stream. And yeah.